Welcome to session number 5 of Biblical Backgrounds. I'm John McMath, professor at Moody Bible Institute, retired for just long enough now to wonder how I ever managed to find time to work for a living. Today we will be continuing in Bible Backgrounds, looking at most of today at the geography of Israel itself. I call this session the Patriarchs Palestine. Let me make a note about the names that we use while we're studying. The modern nation is called Israel. During the Old Testament, from the time of King Saul until the Babylonian captivity, mostly we call this place Israel. The geographic name for this from as far back as we can go is Canaan. The politicians and archaeologists of the modern era refer to this whole area as Syria. Okay. Sometimes after the French explorers, we call this region the Levant. Since 1967 or 68, the area has been called Palestine. That's a name that was given to it by the Romans, named after the Philistines, as a way of not referring to Israel or Judea anymore. Okay. All of the names refer to the same general place. It doesn't matter a whole lot what we call this place. When I'm referring to the entire region for all periods, I almost always use the term Palestine. That area was a Turkish province, and it ran all the way from the Lebanon mountains in the north to the borders with Egypt, and from the Mediterranean to the sea. And that pretty much covers the whole area. I do not believe there is a Palestinian people group. There never has been a nation named Palestine or a people group. And there's never been a state named Palestine. When some commentators talk about a two-state solution, they're saying that in addition to Israel, there ought to be another state called Palestine, separate and supported by the international community, for a Palestinian people group. But the Palestinians have always been Arabs, and the Palestinian part of this whole region, mandated under the British after World War I, is today called Jordan. The modern state of Jordan is, in fact, the, quote, Palestinian state. There's no reason at all for the Arabs to have a state on the so-called west bank of the Jordan River. Okay, that's a whole lot of modern politics. Nobody's interested in modern politics. But I wanted to make sure that we understood it. I'm not pro-Palestinian. I do use the term Palestine for the region, however. Let's share the screen, and we're going to get going here. Make sure this happens. Yes, there it goes. And I'm actually getting a feed, well, worldwide. Okay, this is a pretty good picture. This was taken from one of the satellites. I've forgotten which particular one. I think this was Space Lab back in the 80s or 90s. But this good photograph from a satellite. It shows the whole region. The center here is modern Israel, and you can see it from the line in the southwest that divides Israel from the Egyptian Sinai. And you might wonder about that because we always think that it's only on maps that countries are different colors. If you look closely at this, what you'll notice is that that's not an artificial color. Well, actually, these are somewhat artificial colors. The darker color that covers Israel is the color of vegetation, growing things, crops, trees, growing things, places where there are clouds. The line south of that, the Sinai Peninsula, is controlled by the Egyptians, and there is no agriculture at all in that region. The Bible says that one day the people of Israel will return to their land and they'll make the desert bloom. I'd like to bear witness today to the fact that the Israeli desert is blooming. And right across the line, the Egyptian desert is still desert. When we look at this whole region, you can see the Sea of Galilee in the north. That's that little triangular shaped sea. They actually call it a harp. The Kinneret is the name in Hebrew, and they believe it's the shape of a heart. The Dead Sea is the body of water in the south. The Mediterranean, of course, is off to the west. When you look at that line from the Sea of Galilee to the Dead Sea, all of that is the Rift Valley. And I'll show you a better map of that here in a moment. Beyond the Rift Valley is the modern state of Jordan. And so we call that the Transjordanian Plateau, or just the Jordanian Plateau. And you'll notice that it's a drier looking area. That's all the Great Arabian Desert. Now, a bit farther north, about on a level with the Sea of Galilee, is what we call the Golan Heights that lead up toward Damascus. And Damascus in this photograph is actually under a bit of cloud. But this shows the whole region. We're going to talk about this in a little more detail here, if I can get my next map to come up. There we go. Okay. I put this map deliberately with north at the left instead of north at the top. There is no particular reason for north to be at the top of a map. In biblical times, nobody knew that magnets would point north. Nobody knew that there was a North Pole and a South Pole. And so there was no good reason for maps to be up. And in fact, biblical maps, or the suggestions that we have of biblical era maps, have east at the top because that's where the sun rises. The practical reason for putting east at the top of a map of Israel is that Israel is long and skinny. And if I put east at the top, I've actually got room for quite a lot of detail on the map. Now you'll notice that this is another satellite map, and it's a little closer than that last satellite map. It was also shot in a different time, and it was shot at with a different kind of optics, so we get different color. But we're still getting the entire nation of Israel. Just for reference, the distance from the left-hand edge of the map to the right-hand edge of the map is about 150 kilometers. The distance across the map is about 120 kilometers. The nation of Israel is the land to the south of that Galilee Dead Sea line. At its widest point, Israel is about 100 kilometers wide. At its narrowest point in the north, at about the Sea of Galilee, Israel is about 50 kilometers wide. And for those with military experience, that's a very small piece of ground. In a tank, you can cover that ground in a few hours. In a fighter plane, you can cover that in a few seconds. With an artillery piece, you can cover that ground in the blink of an eye. The area is very, very small. In ancient times, people walked around this place on foot, and so it took longer, but it was still a relatively small piece of ground. And it was the sort of place that you could, in fact, walk around on foot and expect to see everything. To this day, I believe the best way of seeing Israel is to get out of your bus and get out on foot. There are hiking trails, some of them going back 3,000 years, that are still accessible and well maintained today. People get out of the bus and go out on either short walks or really quite long hikes. I've done all of that all over Israel, and I can tell you that this is a walking-sized country. If all you ever see of Israel is from a tour bus, you'll miss most of it. Because there's so much that it's so close together. Okay, let's think of a cross section. If we were to draw a line from the north side or from the east side of the map to the west side of the map, from the desert, let's say through the Sea of Galilee or through the Dead Sea. Let's go south, and we'll run from about the place where between the 3 and the 4 at the top of the page, and roughly Tel Aviv on the west side. And you'll see that there's a very deep valley right in the middle. We call this the Great Rift Valley. This is a land feature that's easy to identify from a satellite. In the north, it runs all the way into central Syria. In the south, it continues down the Red Sea into Africa, all the way to Victoria Falls in Central Africa. There's a major valley. It was created by the opening up of the earth. In the northern part of this valley on this map, you can see little black dots. Those are volcanoes. The northern part of this valley is volcanic. The southern parts are made up of primarily a sandstone plateau in the east and limestones on the west. Most of Israel is made up of limestones, a harder limestone in the mountains and a softer limestone that has formed rolling hills and the coastal plains. That the presence of limestone has meant a lot of things for Israel over the years. Among other things, limestone is relatively soft, so it's possible to cut it, to quarry it, to build walls from it, to build houses from it. And if you cut through a layer of limestone in the central hill country of Israel, you're very likely to run into a lower layer of chalk. Sometimes chalk is called kurkar, and the Arabs have used chalk for years for building, and they'll quarry away at the chalk. So much so that we find today chalk caves, great huge caves, sometimes 100 feet deep and 75 or 80 feet across at the bottom, that the Arabs have used to quarry and to make their homes out of chalk. You have to be careful with your roof if you're going to use chalk for a wall, but it's still a good building material. The limestone itself is the characteristic building material of the kings of Canaan and later the kings of Judah, all the way down to the time of Herod the Great. When we look at Herod's wall in Jerusalem, that magnificent western wall, that's all limestone. The light blondish color of the limestone in Israel is sometimes called Jerusalem stone, because the modern state of Israel has required that any construction inside the city limits of Jerusalem has to be covered with Jerusalem limestone. It's a law. Anyway, okay, so there's a Rift Valley. In the north, the Rift Valley starts in the Upper Galilee. There's a great valley up there that goes all the way up to Mount Hermon in the north, runs through the Sea of Galilee, down the Jordan River, down into the Dead Sea. The Dead Sea is 400 meters below sea level, lowest spot on the planet, and that's where the Jordan River ends. The Transjordanian Plateau is about 2,500 to 3,000 feet above sea level, mostly sandstone with volcanoes in the north. And then the desert starts at the edge of the rugged wadi or canyon country. You can see that rainfall and erosion have caused canyons to be cut. In Arabic and then in Hebrew, these are called wadis, W-A-D-I. And a wadi is just a dry riverbed that holds water for a bit when it rains. And when it rains, there'll be flash floods in these canyons. The major wadi systems divide the Transjordanian Plateau into 4 or 5, depending on how big an area you're looking at, major habitable sections. And the nations of the ancient world who lived here were separated from one another by those wadis because travel is difficult. So it's a good place to put your border. On the west side of the Jordan, the first major feature is a mountain spine. It begins in the south at Hebron, which is about on a level with the middle of the Dead Sea, and it runs all the way north to the Galilee. The mountains of Galilee are in general just called the Galilee, and that's all the way in the north. And we've got places as high as, let's see, 3,500 feet, about 11 or 1,200 meters is the high point of the Galilee. Mount Hermon itself is about 3,500 meters. It's a fairly substantial mountain in the north. Jerusalem sits at about 800 meters. Okay, between the mountain spine and the coastal plain is rolling hill country from the Carmel Ridge in the north all the way to the Negev in the south, the Shfela. And I'll pronounce that again because people look at this and they want to pronounce it Shephelah or something like that. The modern Israelis say Shfela, and they're talking about the rolling hill country. I'll show you some pictures of that in a bit. This is prime agricultural country for modern Israel. The best agricultural is, of course, in the coastal plains, but the Shfela, in most of history, were the prime population area. Most of the Canaanite cities are found in Shfela. Okay, the coastal plain is well watered. There's all of the little rivers that form in the Judean hill country drain out into the coastal plain, and eventually they find their way to the Mediterranean Sea. But along the way, all along the coast for a couple of miles inland from the coast are sand dunes. These sand dunes have tended to block the drainage so that throughout most of history, up until about 100 years ago, the coastal plain had malaria. There would be marshes all along the coastal plain. 130 years ago, the first Jews, 140 years ago, 1887, 1888, in that range, the first Jews from Europe and from Russia began coming to Israel, and they bought land from the absentee Turkish and Egyptian landlords, and somebody sold them a patch of marsh and sand dunes north of the old Arab town of Jaffa in the coastal plain. And the Jews who were moving into this recognized that this is a malarial marsh and this is a bad place. But the Turkish landowner was willing to sell this. And so they named the place Tel Aviv, which was one of the settlements of Mesopotamia when the Jews during the Babylonian captivity lived in Mesopotamia. One of their towns was Tel Aviv. So they named this sandy malarial swamp Tel Aviv and began planting eucalyptus trees. During the first year of their settlement there, half of the settlers died of malaria. By the second year, the second half of the settlers who had first moved in were dead. But a new group had come into the area and they kept planting trees. Over a period of about 10 years, those trees drained the swamps, and the settlers were finally able to conquer the malaria and begin to build the modern city that we still call Tel Aviv. Tel Aviv today is very much like Los Angeles. It's a great big city, very spread out with freeways everywhere, tall buildings, lots and lots of people, very secular city. It's a very modern city. There's no real antiquity sites in Tel Aviv. A few near there, but not right in Tel Aviv anymore. And we Christians who are there looking for biblical sites tend not to bother with Tel Aviv, but it's the big central hub of modern Israel, and kind of exciting just for that reason. So they're in the coastal plain. Okay, now let's look at some a little more detail. We'll take those big names off the map. The Rift Valley starts in the north at the Sea of Galilee. Sea of Galilee is about 200 meters below sea level. The entire Jordan River, once it has gotten out of the mountains and has come up to the springs at places like Dan and Caesarea Philippi, the Jordan River proceeds south on its course entirely below sea level. So the Sea of Galilee is drained by the Jordan River that finally goes into the Dead Sea, which is about 400 meters below sea level. And that's where the Jordan River stops. The Jordan never makes it to the Red Sea. The southern part of the Rift Valley continues uphill all the way to the Gulf of Eilat, where it ends, but it's dry the entire distance. There's the Dead Sea. The Dead Sea is dead because it has no outlet. Water runs in, but it evaporates out. That means the Dead Sea is full of salt. It's a very, very salty body of water. It continues to get more salty every year, which is a very good indication that it's relatively young. The Dead Sea is not millions or billions of years old, it's thousands of years old, which is also interesting for those of us who believe in a young Earth. The Mediterranean, and for that matter, the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, continue to get more salty. As material flows down rivers into the big oceans, all of our oceans continue to get more salty. And you can calculate the age of the ocean if you want to. It's, I think, not a very accurate measurement, but at present rates, the Pacific Ocean would have been fresh water about 10,000 years ago. Just one more argument for a young Earth. The Dead Sea, however, is even younger, but it's very, very, very salty because it's a small place, and it keeps on getting more and more salt all the time. Okay, what else have I got here? The mountains of Galilee in the north, Hagalil in Hebrew. The opposite side of the Sea of Galilee, we call the Golan Heights. And it's just as high as the Galilee, but made of basalt instead of limestone. The main mountain that divides the northern part of Israel from the southern part of Israel is called the Carmel Ridge. And that ridge goes all the way out into the Mediterranean. It's quite a roadblock for transportation north and south, and that has had major historical issues. The valley just to the north of the Carmel Ridge is called the Jezreel. It runs from Haifa on the coast all the way into Mount Gilboa. That Carmel Ridge takes a kind of a left turning hook at the eastern end just before the Jordan River. And at the northern part of that hook is Mount Gilboa, which looks across the Jezreel Valley at the Galilee. South of Carmel is the central hill country of Israel. And we sometimes call this Samaria. That's really the New Testament term. The Old Testament term would be the hill country of Ephraim. But this central hill country is a beautiful territory. The valleys are broad and they have nice flat bottoms, lots of mountains. But the valleys are beautiful places and very fertile. South of Samaria is the hill country of Judah, what we call Judea. And you can see that somewhat dark wadi pointing toward the interior. That would be the location of Jerusalem. That's the Sorek Valley, pointing up toward Jerusalem. Okay, let's look at some pictures along the way. The Jordan Valley feels like it ought to have a river in the middle of it, and it does, but you very rarely get to see the river. The Jordan River is in the middle of a military zone. The whole region between Israel and the modern state of Jordan is a broad, fertile valley, and there are lots of farmers living and working out there. But it's generally a military security area. Israel and Jordan had been at war for many, many years. They're currently in a state of relative peace, which means they're not shooting at each other anymore, but they're not exactly friends. What is fascinating is that the Jordan River follows a very winding course. Lots and lots of oxbows and twists and turns. It's a very windy river. It's about 100 kilometers from the Sea of Galilee to the Dead Sea. It's almost 300 kilometers of actual river length. The river itself is not very big. It's typically no more than 5 to 10 meters across. Very small river. But during flood season, it can cut brand new channels in all of this soft mud. The Israeli and Jordanian farmers have gotten used to that. So if flood season comes and a truck is marooned on a newly cut oxbow, the new owners just keep using the truck until the next time the floods come and the truck ends up on the other side. The Israelis and Jordanians have worked out practical ways of doing agriculture in this place. It's a kind of a de facto truce, and it has worked for years. Okay, so the Jordan Valley with rivers and lakes divides Palestine, this whole region, into two long parts. The entire course, as I mentioned before, including this bit that I'm looking at here, I'm looking across into Jordan. This whole valley is below sea level. The Eastern Plateau country is a lot of rolling hills for the first, probably 15 to 20 kilometers. And then all very flat, arid desert. And I don't have a lot of desert shots. You can visualize desert. This is land on the way up to Amman, Jordan. The hill country of the north is quite rugged. Both of these photographs are taken in the area to the west of the Sea of Galilee. The area that we call the Judean Shephelah is this rolling country. This photograph is taken from the top of a place called Tel Gezer, which is not too far from Tel Aviv. And you can see the low rolling country, but there in the background, the backdrop of this photograph is the Judean hills. So there's not all that much difference between the hill country and the low country. The really big difference is the kind of limestone. The hill country is made of a fairly hard limestone, and it makes V-shaped, difficult traveling valleys. The lower country is made of a softer, chalkier limestone. There's a technical name for the kinds of limestone, but I always forget it. In the area where I'm standing, you can see some of the chalky soil that is there. However, this territory has tended to make very fertile fields, and the Israelis have done very well at making agriculture happen here. This is a field that's just been plowed, and here we see a field next to the freeway from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, with a lake out in the middle of it. It's really not bad at all. Since this photograph was taken, the Israelis have actually planted trees in this region. It gets more and more. The coastal plain is, as I mentioned, filled up with the Los Angeles, in Hebrew, city of Tel Aviv. That's Tel Aviv on the right. The beaches of Tel Aviv, 8 or 9 months a year, tend to be very crowded. Tourists come down from Europe because this is a warm place. It's a nice place to go visit, especially in the off season. Tel Aviv has always been a popular vacation destination. I'm not so fond of it because it's just crowded, but it is fun to see the development of a modern Israeli state. In the upper left-hand corner, I'll bet some of you can read that modern Hebrew. That's all modern Hebrew. Can you read that? Let's see if you can figure it out. It says, Chateau, Coca-Cola. Simo Tachos. Okay, so Coca-Cola. Now we recognize the brand name there. Drink Coca-Cola; it satisfies. And in Hebrew, of all things, interestingly, up until fairly recently, Coca-Cola was sold in Israel, and for that reason, all of the Arab countries drink Pepsi instead. I frankly don't care one way or the other. I don't particularly like Coke either, but it's that's been the deal in the Middle East for a long time. Lower left-hand corner is a restaurant I shot years ago in Tel Aviv, McDavid's. It's like McDonald's, only in Israel. This was before the actual McDonald's began showing up in Israel. Today, you can get a McDonald's burger if that's what you feel like you've got to have, and they're everywhere. They're just all over the place in Israel. Okay, this is up by the Sea of Galilee, and the geography of this area has always had effects on history. This particular rock feature is called Mount Arbel. It doesn't usually make much difference what it's called, but this is the mountain that forms the major landmark on the north-south highway through Israel. And we'll be talking about that later, the Via Maris. And the term Via Maris means the way of the sea. And the sea in question is not the Mediterranean, which it never gets particularly close to, but rather this sea, the Sea of Galilee. This particular mountain is the spot where you leave the edge of the Sea of Galilee to go up into the mountains of Galilee for the trip south. Okay, unlike the Nile and the Euphrates, which both had enormous effects on civilization, the Jordan had relatively little effect on local civilization. People in general didn't develop the water of the Jordan Valley until fairly modern times. It was necessary to build pumps in order to irrigate and that's something that hasn't happened until recently. The settlements around the Sea of Galilee in biblical times were mostly for fishing, and the agriculture happened in other places. Today, the Jordan River is, of course, heavily used for water, and that's a major issue in the place. The Palestinian variety in land form and in valleys and rocky outcroppings led to isolated people groups. The Canaanite people who were here before the Israelites came tended to live in relatively small enclaves. So there was no single unified Canaanite nation. There were individual Canaanite city-states, and the Mesopotamian power, which could be a great power because of the nature of the Mesopotamian Valley, and the Egyptian power, which could also be a great power because of the nature of the Nile Valley, when they were walking through this area on their way to make war with one another, would interact with individual small city-states rather than with a powerful central government. The first real central government over this region was Israel under King Saul. And his government was only partially successful. Under King David and then under King Solomon, there's a single united government. The kings of Israel down to the Babylonian captivity are the first continuous unified nation state that occupied the entire land of Israel. And so today, when the Arabs say that they were the original keepers of this land, but they're lying. Yes, there were Canaanites here, and Amorites and Hittites and Hivites and Perizzites and Girgashites, and there were all kinds of different people groups in isolated, tiny areas. God gave Israel this whole land, and they produced a single unified nation on a piece of land that was, quite frankly, hard to keep unified. The position of Palestine in between Egypt and Mesopotamia meant that throughout most of history, it's been subject to the whims of the larger powers. The powers in Mesopotamia particularly, and in Egypt particularly, came back and forth through this territory. There are parts of the Palestinian landscape that are not particularly desirable. Jericho tends to be hot and humid, and has always had a malaria problem. The coastland was swampy along most of its range throughout most of history. And so there are very few ports on the Mediterranean side. What ports there are, like Joppa and farther in the north at Akko, tend to be very small. They're designed for shallow draft vessels. The big seagoing ships couldn't pull into these places because there are no deep ports. It just didn't allow that. The Judean wilderness out south of Jerusalem tends to be arid and inhospitable. Travel in Israel requires quite a bit of stamina. As you can see from this photograph, there's a lot more vertical than you would think. You're always climbing up and crawling down the far side. Even driving, you notice the hills. Newcomers like Abraham would have made big adjustments just in their living style. to move from Mesopotamia, where everything is relatively flat, and there's one large government controlling everything, to a place like Canaan, where individual warlords controlled tiny patches of ground, and to a place where there's so much mountainous country. Would have been a big difference. Abraham changed. So before Abraham got there, there's a few things that we know about it. The promised land by the time of Abraham was already very old. This photograph on the right is Jericho, and that the tower that I'm looking down at is about 20 meters tall. And the top of that tower is about 10 meters below the present surface of the tell. So that tells us just basically that that's a very, very old tower. That's really old. That was built on bedrock, or what passes for bedrock in this area of the Jordan Valley. That tower, at its base, has debris that shows that it was built before people knew how to make pottery. So we call it pre-pottery Neolithic. The professional archaeologists talk about this as 8,000 BC. As I've said before, I dispute the dates. I think the dates are too high. I don't think it's anywhere near that hall. But this is still Jericho, a city that was there from the very earliest times, probably shortly after the flood, and at a time when people had not yet learned to make pottery. During this time, the thing on the left is called an execration text. This is fascinating. We find these in Egypt. And this particular little pottery statue is a Palestinian king of some kind, a Canaanite king, an Amorite king. I'm not sure which one he is. And the Egyptian potentate who wanted to curse somebody would write the name and a curse on this little clay statue and then take it to the temple and smash it against the altar. So we found temples in Egypt with the execration texts, these cursing texts about all of the little city-states in Palestine. The Egyptians just hated these people. This dates to roughly 4,000 to 3,000 BC. And again, I doubt the dates, but it doesn't matter. So this was already old. Here is Megiddo at the period before Abraham. And the Megiddo high place is today one of the lowest places in the tell. It's been excavated. You can see I'm standing on a relatively high observation point, and there's some high ground far away. That's all been cut away by hand. Archaeologists have done this, and you see the stones piled up there. That was an early Bronze Age EB, early Bronze Age high place. It was used by the Canaanites who lived in Megiddo from around 3000 to around 2000 BC. So about the time of Abraham, this went out of use. Let's see if I've got some pictures of this. I wonder if this might work. Ooh, there it is. There's that modern overlook where I was standing, looking down into it. It's another view, and you can see the round altar. There are actually half a dozen altars in the Megiddo high place, different temples to different gods. The Canaanite low walls were a part of their altar. Notice how they're built. Big stones interspersed with little stones. We call it cyclops walls. This is a good view of the circular altar. This is a really bad place. When the archaeologists were digging this up, part of what they discovered was thousands and thousands of bones. And these were human bones. And as they analyzed and put together the skeletons that they could, they realized that these were the bones of infants and children. The Canaanites who lived here believed that they could make their gods and or goddesses happy by killing their own children. This is a terrible place and a disgusting place. And there it was in the years before Abraham. You can see that this altar is about 12 meters across and about 2 meters high. It was a huge thing. With a set of steps, the priests would carry children up onto this altar for murder, to murder them. It's a terrible place. Some more of this area of Megiddo. There's a temple here. This is a separate temple from the temple, or from the altar that you see in the background. There's a separate altar for this one. The temples at Megiddo betray an outer room and an inner room. There's a courtyard where the altar is located, an outer room, which is the holy place, and an inner room, the Holy of Holies, where the idol itself would have been located, and often altars for incense and lavers and the rest of it. Okay, enough of that. I'm going to do one last thing while we're in Palestine before Abraham. I want to tell you the story of Sinuhe. Sinuhe was an Egyptian official who apparently fled Egypt to Palestine during the early Bronze Age. He was the servant, some kind of middle-level bureaucrat of a nobleman in Egypt. And when the nobleman died, Sinuhe felt like his life was in danger, so he went running. His adventures end up taking him among the Bedouin of Syria. Here's a Bedouin tent on the right, and on the left, in its silhouette, is a Bedouin householder making coffee for us. And to this day, Bedouin hospitality is legendary. We know that Sinuhe traveled along the coast of Sinai and Israel and went all the way to Byblos in northern Lebanon. His track follows the coastline. So the starting point is here in Egypt, in the land of Goshen, approximately the same as Israel would use many, many years later. He came up the coast through the Sinai, and it's at this point he almost died. His group was caught in a sandstorm. Everyone died except Sinuhe. He was rescued by the Bedouin. He passed from country to country. No one would help him. It's an interesting story because it shows that during this age, which would have been the first intermediate period, Egypt was a very weak nation. He finally ends up at the north of his travels in Byblos in Lebanon, but fears for his life, and the people of Byblos make fun of him. He flees inland into a place that at the time was called Retinue, that we know as modern Syria. The value of the Sinuhe epic is the glimpse that the story gives us into early Bronze Age diplomacy. The Egyptians, the Mesopotamians, and all of these little countries in between had diplomatic relationships. They interacted in a variety of ways. The Sinuhe story may or may not be based on a true story. It doesn't really matter very much. The point of the Sinuhe story is the insight that it gives us into Egypt's relationship to this whole area. Next time when we come back, we're going to take a good look at Abraham, the friend of God, at Abraham and his journey from Ur through Haran to Palestine, and then his interactions when he got there. And all of this is illustrated by just tons of stuff. The farther we get into biblical history, the more background details we're going to uncover. And that's just a part of the fun. I'm going to stop the share. And I'm going to unmute everybody. So I appreciate you all being along for the ride. This has been fun. I really get a kick out of looking at the pictures and remembering the time that I've spent in Israel and the surrounding region. Looking at the pictures is, I think, helpful. Reading as much of the background as you can with a map available is a big help. Just recognizing that most everything in Israel is within walking distance. These people really did walk. They went to war, they went on foot. They went out to the field to work, they went on foot. And their animals maybe went with them. So it's a much, much smaller territory than most of us are used to. I hope this is helpful. We're going to get back together again next time. However, I just remembered, Wednesday there will be no class, so I won't see you again until Monday. I'll put a note out on Facebook saying that the Wednesday class won't be happening. Donna needs a small procedure and I have to be gone. So we'll see you again next Monday. God bless everybody. And we'll see you when we get back together again. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
Ciao, ciao.
Thank you, Dr. John.
Thank you.
Grazie.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, mga pastor.
Bye-bye.